Thanks for staying with us. Now, South Africa's capability in combating money laundering is being questioned. The International Financial Action Task Force is considering grey-listing the country. That could have an impact on the cost of capital here and international transactions. But let's unpack the extent of the problem. With us is Mashudu Masuta from Corruption Watch. Willie Hofmeyer is the former head of the National Asset Forfeiture Unit, and chartered accountant and expert Khaya Sithole. Thank you all three so much for your time this evening. We do appreciate it. Mr. Hofmeyer, let's just start off with you. From my understanding, you were the first head of the Asset Forfeiture Unit in the eNCA, and I want us to perhaps speak about where we started and where we are today. Do you think that we are combating money laundering, or do you think it's still a very big problem?
I think it is still a significant problem, although I think it is much better than it was in the past. But you are right, is that the anti-money laundering legislation was only promulgated in South Africa in the late 1990s, when democracy was starting to be on the horizon. And so it is relatively new in South Africa. But I think we've done quite well generally in South Africa on the anti-money laundering front. But I think one of the biggest challenges we face in South Africa is that many people still deal with large quantities in cash, which is not really supposed to happen when you've got an effective money laundering system.
And we always wonder how people move this money around, but we'll get into that throughout this discussion. Mashudu, let's perhaps bring you in here. And I want us to perhaps look at part of what I said in my introduction, where I said South Africa could possibly be grey-listed by global financial watchdog, the Financial Action Task Force, and how serious this actually is, considering the fact that we are being looked at as a country that's not dealing with money laundering at a level that is accepted.
Yes, this is a significant situation that we're in as a country. I think it's important to just take a step back slightly to just explain where this comes from. So this comes from the report, the mutual evaluation report that was done by FATF, where FATF was trying to ascertain the state effectiveness of compliance of standards. And one of the key aspects with regards to the low effectiveness of the country related to the vulnerabilities within the South African legislative framework relating to beneficial ownership. So this is essentially the use of anonymous shell companies and other complex financial structures for illicit finance and tax evasion. So we know on a global level that criminals tend to use legal persons and opaque legal structures as a way in which they can hide ownership and mask their own assets. We see it in the leaks and investigative reports. So the finding of this should not be surprising, because we see it in headlines that talks about, senior political officials owning a company or procuring or being selected to procure goods and services for the country, and so on. So this comes from a state of affairs that the country is well aware of. It's just now with FATF considering grey-listing the country, there's going to be significant consequences on the economy, and we do know that our economy is in a state where we cannot afford to have any kind of grey-listing from FATF.
Khaya, let's bring you in here, and I perhaps want to touch on a point that Mashudu spoke about, where she said massive impact on our economy. And there's an interesting article that speaks about how Pakistan, as well as Botswana, if I'm not mistaken, lost billions because they were grey-listed and they were seen as a country where don't take your money there. There are high levels of money laundering. Do we have any idea how much our economy loses because of money laundering?
So good evening to the viewers, and the simple answer is no. And of course, the whole problem with the money laundering regime and the way money laundering works is that it's literally creating a parallel economy where those that want to be able to move money across different jurisdictions find creative and obviously sometimes illegal ways to be able to do so. And I think the problem that's always existed is that every single country wants to be able to understand who's transacting in its currency first and foremost, and who's transacting in its country. So when we deal with money laundering activities, it's essentially a whole lot of criminal endeavors, for example, that are then in a position to use the currency of a country or the resources of a country in order to move money into opaque structures, into criminal structures that are going to facilitate some very, very problematic activities. So the problem is that because there has never been a holistic assessment of who exactly does what and how it ought to be done, we don't know what the gap is. But what anti-money laundering regulations are trying to do is to simply say that we as financial institutions, we as public institutions, and we as the banks, for example, should be able to ask important questions so that we understand the money flows that are happening through our system. Because obviously at some point in time, somebody is going to have to ask the question of, well, if you look at some terrorist organizations, for example, how do they get access to cash? And that simply means that the cash has to be part of the formal system first and foremost, and then be converted or translated into the informal systems. So the answer of how much money laundering costs countries is completely the unknown. What countries are trying to do is to actually close the loopholes and close the gaps that enable money to be laundered around. And obviously one day when we feel that we've mastered or perfected the systems, we'll be able to say that anything else that happens is beyond the scope or the jurisdiction or the competency of what the public institutions are able to do.
Mr. Hofmeyer, you having been the former head of the National Asset Forfeiture Unit, there are many concerns and cries that the National Prosecuting Authority is not perhaps doing enough or not doing things quick enough. And I wonder, and perhaps we can get your perspective of this, if the National Prosecuting Authority should be doing more and can be doing more when it comes to money laundering. Many would say, for example, the Guptas, they were in our country, they were doing as they pleased for years on end, and only years later were they arrested. And there was definitely some, aspect of money laundering and allegations brought about of money laundering. Your perspective of whether or not the National Prosecuting Authority can do more and should do more when it comes to combating money laundering?
I certainly think that it is the NPA's mandate to deal with money laundering. But we must bear in mind that the actual investigation of money laundering is dealt with by the Hawks. So it is a collaboration between the NPA and the Hawks. But I do think that our capacity at the moment in the state to deal effectively with especially some of the sophisticated money laundering schemes that there are, our capacity is not good enough to really combat money laundering sufficiently so that criminals start feeling there is a real deterrent. At the moment, I think they're not that worried about our capacity to deal effectively with money laundering.
Especially because we have so much to deal with. Mashudu, let's bring you in here. So from my understanding, it seems as though the Financial Action Task Force that could possibly grey list the country has cited, for example, issues such as significant shortcomings implementing an effective system, including a failure to pursue serious cases. And this is perhaps where the Hawks or the NPA could come in to say, these are the cases we are looking at, this is of great concern for us. But perhaps why we are not pursuing these serious cases, and if the writing is on the wall that this is a concern of, a certain case might be a concern of money laundering, why aren't we looking into it?
I think it's a tricky one in the sense that these cases are highly complex. They aren't straight cuts. They need extraordinary amount of resources and capacity, and so it requires a particular kind of skill set, which was mentioned by the head of the NPA. In response to whether or not there's going to be prosecution of the complex commercial crimes that were highlighted in the Zondo reports, that they just don't have the skills and the capacity to manage all of them. It comes from that. It's the reality that's there. But I think there's been a lot of movements since some of these findings have come up, particularly from the Zondi Commission of Inquiry report relating to commercial crimes, where the Business Unity South Africa has mentioned that they're going to be working together with senior prosecutors and really assist the NPA to deal with some of these matters. But these matters are matters that run for extraordinarily long time. Again, they require skills and resources. So it's not necessarily an easy, smooth sailing form of going through the courts and then there's going to be arrest for it. But I think there's a lot of room for government to implement a lot of regulation and policy around transparency that can enable for at least the finding of flows of money or dealing with the mechanisms which enable the illicit financial flows. And what we see most of the time is the use of companies. So where there is an adequate beneficial ownership transparency regulation, so dealing with the way in which companies are established and used, then you're going to have a significant impact on the illicit financial flows that take place, whether from South Africa or through South Africa.
Kai, I've always wondered when people say money was laundered, 600 million, 1 billion, and I think to myself, how did they get the money into the country if it did come from another country? And, as Mashudu says, is there really transparency? And I wonder if there is, because from my understanding, it seems as though the South African Reserve Bank has last month, in fact, rated that the likelihood of a grey listing is very high. And it just seems as though we are aware of money laundering, but everybody's just saying, well, the problem might be too big for us to handle.
Look, I think obviously a country like South Africa has to really ask itself the question of whether its systems, whether it's talking about border control and similar things like that, are strong enough to be able to ensure that we actually don't have such particular problems. Unfortunately, as you would know, Heidi, there are far too many problems that we have in the country in relation to people, how people get in or get out of the country, which means that the risk of them being able to, smuggle items in and out of the country, whether it's hard currency, whether it's rhino horns, remains remarkably high. Until we get our law enforcement and criminal systems and enforcement systems to be much better, the risk is always there. But of course, there are different and very creative ways in which we can get around this. And the easiest way is obviously to simply be able to pay off the right officials, to pay off the right bureaucrats in order for you to be able to smuggle in and out of the country, whether you are smuggling in currency or hard currency like we're talking about, for example, or you smuggling in other items. It still is, unfortunately, a remarkably fragile system. And I think until we fix the system at large, the risks are always going to be there. The problem, of course, is that we can only ever talk about the rare instances where we find out, the rare instances where the law enforcement officials are alert enough to be able to pick up something. So the only matters that ever get reported are the ones that get tracked, the ones that get detected. There are far too many that elude the system at large. So that's why I was saying earlier on, we actually don't know how big the scale of the problem is. So I think in South Africa, we actually have to go back to the fundamental problem that our borders are far too fragile, our law enforcement systems are far too problematic, and we just haven't got the right model to ensure that we as a country can vouch for all activities that are happening, particularly in relation to cross-border activities and cross-border currency movements.
Mr. Hofmeyer, I wonder if you are able to answer this, and perhaps from your experience as being the first and the former head of the National Asset Forfeiture Units, who exactly launders money in this country? Are we speaking about private companies? Are we speaking about individuals? How deep is the problem actually?
I think the reality is that anybody who's committing crime does want to launder their money so that other people cannot be, or that law enforcement and others should not be able to track down the money or find it easily. And I think for me, one of the critical weaknesses in our system at the moment is the issue of family trusts, where the Master's Office, which is run by the Department of Justice, I think there is now an effort to make it electronic. But the reality is, for a very long time, it was just paper-based, and there was no index of who has a family trust, who doesn't have a family trust, who are the people with the interest in the trust. So for me, that's one of the critical issues that we need to deal with and fix if we are going to be able to deal proactively with preventing the laundering of money.
That's an interesting one, family trusts. I think people sometimes forget about that. Mashudu Masutsa, let's perhaps end off with you. Do you think that the problem is going to get worse considering the consequences of perhaps being grey listed? Or do you think, as Kaya and Mr. Hofmeyer have indicated, that there are so many problems, it's sometimes difficult for the eNCA to have enough resources to deal with this?
I think, the reality of money laundering and terror financing is that it's a global issue. It's not just a South African issue. When we talk about flows of money, it's either from here going somewhere else or coming through the country. I think what was actually quite fascinating from the FATF report was that when they looked at all the jurisdictions, about 52% of these jurisdictions that they had assessed had adequate laws and regulations, but only 9% of the countries were actually effective in implementing money laundering and terror financing laws. So I think it's really about ensuring that the laws are fit for purpose, number one, but also ensuring, number two, that the pain points, because FATF is risk-based, so the pain points that have been highlighted by this FATF report, which include the topic that Advocate Hofmeyer mentioned about the use of trusts, the abuse of company, currency manipulation, all of those pain points are addressed in regulation, and there is a way in which there could be some kind of collective action with regards to capacity building of the NPAs or your law enforcement agencies to ensure that they're able not only to identify and assess money laundering, terror financing, but actually go through the court processes so there can be arrests.
Certainly. I think there's still a lot of work that needs to be done, and hopefully South Africa will not be grey listed, because there are dire consequences should that happen. Thank you all three so much. That was Mashudu Masutsa from Corruption Watch, as well as Willie Hofmeyer, who is the former and the first head of the National Asset Forfeiture Unit, and Chartered Accountant Kaya Sithole. Thank you all so much for speaking to us this evening with regards to money laundering.